So let's talk about Biden's attempted student loan forgiveness and the Supreme Court striking it down. Now, to take a step back, what exactly is it that Biden did? From my understanding, there was an act back in 2003 called the HEROES Act that allows the president to uh, carry out certain statutory or regulatory provisions with regards to borrowers that are affected in a time of emergency. And basically, how that was interpreted was because COVID happened, it was a national emergency. People were losing money, people were losing their jobs. And Biden used that power, sorry, or rather, Trump used that power to pause payments on student loans. He said, look, given this crisis, people don't have to pay their student loans until after the crisis is over. We're going to suspend payments, we're going to suspend interest until the end of the crisis. And when Biden came to power, he decided to extend this further and he issued a partial forgiveness of existing student loans. Now, I've gone through and I've tried to figure this out, but like every US government program, there's like five or six different like overlapping programs that have incoherent acronyms, and there's so many carve outs and exemptions, and like something sort of applies in this case, something sort of applies in that case. I do get why Americans complain about government bureaucracy so much. Like Canada's bad. There's a lot of issues in Canada, and I make like criticize Canada all the time. I don't think our government bureaucracy here is anywhere near as bad. At least when it comes to having like a whole bunch of different programs. I find how the American federal government tends to deal with things is they just slap like an endless stream of bandages on, and you can't really tell which bandages even for which after a while. But anyway, so Biden issued a blanket $10,000 student loan forgiveness for anyone who makes less than $125,000 a year or has a family income of $250,000 a year. For students who receive Pell Grants, which from my understanding is a specific grant given to low income students who displayed exceptional need, they are being forgiven $20,000. And there was some other stuff I really couldn't figure out about delaying interest payments or capping the amount of money that can be taken from people's paychecks a month. There's a bunch of other stuff, but basically the media headline is that Biden used the emergency generated by COVID-19 to cancel approximately $400 billion in student loan debt, which raises another question of why there's like $400 billion of student loan debt to begin with. From my understanding, it's about $1.8 trillion total in student loan debt. So this isn't even a quarter of it. This is like maybe one fifth of the total student loan debt, or a bit less, somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of the student loan debt that you have in the United States. Now, conservatives were very strongly against this ever since it happened. I guess you could say there was maybe three different there was a bunch of reasons they were against it. The first one, first and foremost, is we got to cut spending, we got to balance the budget. Fiscal conservatism is based on the idea that we have to cut taxes, not cut spending. In fact, keep normal spending the same, but dramatically increase the amount of money we spend on the military and give to Israel and give to Ukraine and that kind of thing, rather than increasing spending on anything that might help the average American. That's fiscal conservatism. It's like it's not balancing the budget, it's not reducing the debt, it's not investing in the future, it's cutting taxes without cutting spending and rigging up the debt with worthless military expenses that don't actually help America. So that's number one is fiscal conservatism. This is just spending money that the government doesn't have. The second crowd is like the whole this is unconstitutional. Biden doesn't have the power to do it. That's not what the act is used for. He overstepped his bounds, that kind of thing. It's the job of the judiciary to conduct judicial review and to rein it in and to stop Biden from abusing his power as president of the United States. And that's kind of the second one. The next one is kind of a mixture of resentment Schadenfreude and the remaining fusionist aspects in the Republican coalition. So the idea is we can't do this because taking out a loan is a personal decision. And if you sign on the dotted line, you are 100% responsible for that. And even if, like, it's your fault for taking out a loan you knew you couldn't repay, or it's your fault for studying a worthless subject, or it's your fault for being a millennial, or something like that. And the government just should never get involved with this. They should never, even though the loans were given by the government, people are 100% fiscally responsible for everything they do. So that's number one, unless they're Ukrainian, of course. Part two is, what about all the people who already paid off their student loans? Maybe they worked their way through college, maybe they paid them off already. Those people aren't getting anything. So because we, I guess, want like the current group of people to go through the same or worse hardship than the previous group of people, in the interest of fairness, we can't cancel it for that reason. We can't do that. And I think you probably are starting to see where I come down in on this issue, which is somewhat different than I think at least most mainstream conservatives, but probably even a lot of people in these circles. So my biggest issue with the whole thing is that blanket just canceling student debt without doing anything about the underlying problems in the system is just, it's stupid. The whole goal of this is a way of giving more money to the university. So that money's already been spent. Those students already gave the universities the $400 billion. Is Biden going to do tuition caps? No. Is he going to seize endowments? No. Is anything realistically going to be done to financially make universities responsible for the grossly irresponsible way they run themselves? No. So what they're going to do is they're going to forgive the student debt. They're going to give people like new students more debt. And then that money is going to go to the universities who are going to be able to raise their tuition because there's more student loan debt that is being given out. And it's basically just a big subsidy to the universities. It's kind of like another fiscal shell game where we're just going to keep raising the amount of student loans we give out. And we're just going to like skip the middleman and just say fuck it. And we're just going to forgive the student loans. So it's like this way of laundering money through students to give to universities so they can keep raising their tuition rates without actually doing anything to help to reduce the cost of tuition. And this is something the U.S. government does for like everything. This is how the farm industry works. Is the federal government gives more and more subsidies and loans to farmers so that they can afford farm equipment and supplies. So in many cases it's a monopoly, so then they jack up the cost of everything. So then farmers have to go to the federal government to get more subsidies, and then they raise the price to whatever the amount of subsidies they're getting. And it's just this endless cycle, and that seems to be what's happening here as well. Same thing also happens for drugs a lot of the time. So my biggest criticism is the whole thing is completely pointless. It's not going to address the fundamental issue. Now, how would I address the fundamental issue? Now, as you may have known if you've listened to me for any amount of time, there's, other than journalists, there's no one I hate more than people who work at universities. And if any of you do, I'm sorry, but I hate university admins, I hate professors, I hate the entire educational industrial complex. It is like such a scam, and it ruins so many lives, and most of the people in it are like the most self-indulgent, greedy, lazy, unpleasant people you'll ever meet. So I think the US should just cap tuition. Just say, fuck it. We're going to just pick a number. It can be based on, I don't know, it can be a percentage of the average income in the state, or it could be something like that. And we're just going to pick a cap, and that's what it's going to be. And it increases by a certain number of percentage points a year. And universities just have to deal with it. They just have to deal with, that's the amount of money they can charge. They can fire people. They can cut salaries. they can do something else. So that's number one. You just introduce a tuition cap and just tell universities to go fuck themselves. Number two, I think it's time to start taxing or seizing endowments. Lots of universities have billions and billions of dollars in stocks and other assets that people have given them over time. And while they're sitting on this big trust fund of money that has been donated to them over the years, and these massive F slurs, I know they call me, my university calls me all the time. They're like, we have no money. We need money. We only have like $20 billion in stocks. You're someone who's barely making ends meet, and we need you to give us cash. And I remember during the financial crisis, my school was like, it's rough, guys. We had like $1 billion worth of stocks, and it went down to $800 million worth of stocks, and it's hard. It's hard, but we have to keep gouging people for tuition and fees and stuff like that. I was just like, look, if you guys aren't going to be using it, and you're going to be engaging in this frankly usurious cycle of corruption with the government, just fucking take the money and use it to pay down people's student loans. They aren't using it for anything. Even if they are, I don't really care, because fuck universities and they deserve it. Also, from a political standpoint, they are objectively my enemy on pretty much any cultural or social issue. The large purpose of universities is to take, well, one of them, I mean, there's a lot of them, is to take kids from conservative or Christian families and to basically just through peer pressure and indoctrination destroy them and turn them into generic liberals. If it wasn't for universities and immigration, probably the Republicans would just win every single election by a large margin. But the idea is to try to prevent the demographic issues that liberals have. So anything that hurts them, that makes them reduce their staff, that makes them less able to function, I think is something that's honestly a good idea. So tuition caps, seizing endowments would be a good start. I also think there's something to be said for looking into basing tuition rates to a certain extent as to what the economy currently needs and what it's likely to need in the future. If you have a shortage of a certain trade, then it makes sense to maybe lessen the amount of tuition to go into that trade, or if we need a certain programming skills or whatever, it might be a good idea to do that and to try to push people in that direction through carrots rather than sticks. So that's another thing we can do. If we have a massive doctor shortage, as we do in a lot of Western countries, honestly, not being able to go to medical school because of financial means just shouldn't be a thing. If the person's qualified, I think it costs more in human capacity and nonsense and people dying on wait lists to not fund people's medical education than it does to fund people's medical education. I think we have to rethink how we view university and post-secondary education in general to adapt to the needs of the economy. And one of my big issues is why they don't want to do this is because that's difficult. It's going to take a long time to get people through education system, to take Americans or Canadians or French or British and get them trained to solve the needs of the economy. It's way easier to just bring in a ton of people from the third world and just fill the positions with them. That's easier. That also brings in diversity. That also alters the demographic makeup of the country. And I notice this even for minorities who grew up in Canada or grew up in the United States. They don't give a shit about them. They don't want them to fill these jobs because they can bring in more immigrants from the third world to fill it up instead. So I think there is a natural opposition to that, wherein if they were to reconfigure university to be more about ensuring student success and societal success, that would reduce the demands for immigrants, and that's something they just don't want to do. Regardless of the cost, so we have switching in that direction. We have tuition caps. We have endowments. I think also just at some point, and I know this is a generic conservative talking point, someone does need to just drain the swamp. They just need to slash and burn and just nuke from orbit all of these fucking federal programs that like overarch with each other and just come up with something. So I don't even know. I think honestly, the Canadian system isn't that bad. I'm not sure what tuition is these days, but generally speaking, tuition is fairly affordable. Most people who graduate from school, at least in my experience and from what I've read, have they'll have student loans maybe, but they'll be something they can pay off in a couple of years, maybe a decade at most. The interest rate is fairly low. There is loan forgiveness. There are grants. Um, I think students should have to pay something. I don't think it should be completely free, if only from like a responsibility. I think there is some argument for the responsibility thing where their family should have to put up some of the cost. That's not to say they should be in debt for the rest of their natural lives, but if they have to work through high school to save up some money, maybe work in university or work during the summers, and maybe they have a couple of years of student loan payments afterwards, now we're talking. That sounds reasonable to me. There's also the whole issue of the thing just being usurious. Now, usury to me, and from my understanding of what the definition of it is, a loan wherein the creditor is able to demand more than the principal, or rather than the collateral. So, example, you take out a mortgage to buy a house. You aren't able to make the payments on the house. They take the house away, but you're still on the hook for the balance of the mortgage. To me, that is usury. The bank should have to take the loss because they gave an irresponsible loan, and they take the house, and then that's kind of the end of it. And that's kind of the how I think the difference is between usury and credit is that aspect to it, and there probably should be a limit to how high you can go in interest payments and stuff like that. Usury also includes like really confusing language, deliberately making it hard to repay the loan. There's a lot of stuff that goes into usury. Maybe the biggest aspect of how student loans are usurious is the fact that you can't discharge them during bankruptcy. I think they're like, I'm not sure what the other ones are, but I think they're the only type of debt, with one or two other exceptions, that can't be discharged. So even if you're like, you lose everything, you're out on the street, you still have to make your student loan payment. The IRS agents or whoever will still come and take it from you. You can discharge pretty much any other form of debt, but you're stuck paying that for the rest of your natural life, regardless of what happens. Not being able to discharge debt through bankruptcy is also usurious. And it's once again, it's they decided that funding your education was a wise financial decision in exchange for the loan plus the interest rate. If that doesn't work out and they don't make their return, they don't make their return. I don't like, there's this idea, and this is something I'll give Sharia finance a lot of credit for, that the only responsible party in any of these is the borrower. The borrower is always 100% responsible. There is no need on the borrower. I guess people will say the federal government forces them to do it. I don't know. Anyways, so I think it's usurious. That's another aspect to it. So my point is that Biden is issuing this student loan forgiveness without doing any reforms, and that's the reason that I'm against this. I don't even necessarily think that just doing student loan forgiveness is a bad idea in and of itself. The reality is, given the amount of money that the U.S. wastes on random shit, like the Ukraine war, they claim it's like $113 billion. I don't buy that. I think it's a lot more than that. Like, they spent $113 billion on something that in no way benefits the American people. So that's like a quarter of what they spent on this. We also have like the phenomenon where they're like, oh, well, there was $6 billion that we just lost, and we're going to give that to Ukraine now. They've given Israel like $150 billion, which I also think is not, it's probably much higher. Over the last 30 years, we're spending $800 billion on the military for some reason. It's not really of much benefit to America. The Iraq War was what, like $1 trillion? It might have been Let me just look this up. How much money the Iraq War cost? The Iraq War cost $1 trillion. So all of student loans are let's see here, 1.78. So rather than go to the Iraq, they could have forgiven like more than half of student loans. But no, they have to do that. So as far as the U.S. government wasting money goes, there's worse ways to waste money than to relieve debt in a way that would actually help the average person. Like at this point in time, it's just fucked. Like I don't know like no one is actually going to balance the budget. It's bullshit. If conservatives had a supermajority in the U.S., they would just cut taxes, and they would just like increase defense spending by like 20%, give more money to Israel, give more money to Ukraine, invade some random countries, spend trillions of dollars there. It's like if we're going to spend the money anyways, if the US government's just going to blow through it, I'd rather they give it to the average person than they spend it on, like, I don't know, giving it to like some company or um, whatever the fuck the stimulus program went. Just the black hole of corruption and incompetence and overlapping programs. This is at least like a direct payment to the individual that helps them. So I actually like would probably be supportive of this if it wasn't in the environment like I discussed earlier of just furthering the educational industrial complex and making things just increasing the amount of money that they can scam the American taxpayer for. And let's get back to the fundamental moral question of this argument 22 minutes into the video. But I think we're covering a lot of ground here. So there's the argument, which I guess is an okay argument from conservatives, that this was their responsibility. They made a bad decision and they should have to pay for it. They should have to suffer for the rest of their natural lives because they were 17 years old and they took out a loan that they couldn't afford to pay. Firstly, if we're going to look at this in any kind of Christian context, debt was forgiven at regular intervals. Ironically enough, during as part of the Mosaic Law with the Jubilees, I would argue this whole thing is just fundamentally unchristian to start off with. As is kind of the attitude that we just have to make people suffer because we have to make them suffer, which seems to be a large portion of this, and people are free to disagree with me on that and say I'm making a straw man or whatever, but that's how I feel about the whole thing. The reality of the situation, and I've said this numerous times, because of credentialism, and that's another thing they need to address, but because of credentialism, if you want a decent job, you basically have to get a graduate degree. You have to get a bachelor's degree to like do anything, and you need a master's degree if you want to have a decent job. And the US is like the worst place in the world, or one of the worst places in the world for credentialism. So I would argue there's not even really that much of a choice. I guess there's trades, trades, or whatever, but for a lot of people, the impression and the reality is if they don't get a degree, if they don't go to university, then they're not going to go anywhere in life. They're not going to be able to afford kids. They're not going to be able to afford a middle class lifestyle. There's that aspect to it. There's their parents, the media, their schools, corporations, the government. Everybody's telling them that the smart thing to do is to stay in school, do pharmaceutical drugs, but don't do illegal drugs. Although I guess we're like pro marijuana now, but I digress. It's like stay in school, go to university, get a 4 year degree. I remember when I was in high school, they're like, go get a 4 year degree. It doesn't matter what it's in. You'll build skills that'll make you employable, and then you'll get some easy job for the rest of your life. And that's kind of like the thing that's been sold a lot of these people. And they go to university, and you can say a lot of what they study is like shitty gender studies and critical theory and stuff like that, and that's true. Although once again, they were told that this stuff was valuable. They were told that this is like they were by authority figures they should have trusted, steered in this grossly irresponsible direction. So I think that is something that has to be considered. Also, there's the whole like, what about the people who already paid student loans? It's like what about them? If we're going to go by that logic, then nothing like will ever change. That was what taxi drivers were saying when like Uber came in. Is when we paid all this money for licenses for years. They don't have to do that. It's like, okay, if you want to maybe, I guess to people who already paid their student loans off, you could maybe give them a tax credit they could redeem or something. But to me, that's not really that convincing an argument because it's just there's a limit to how much you can do of that. Eventually, something you do or don't do is going to impact the future generation more than the previous generation. It's just kind of the way that it is. It sucks. It's too bad, but I just don't see how that's really a convincing argument to not do something. You aren't really retroactively punishing the previous generation. You're aiding the current and future one. I think there is a difference to that. Now, if the argument that wants to be made that I'm a lot more sympathetic to is that most of the people who go through these schools are our cultural and political enemies, and anything that disadvantages them and makes their lives worse and makes it more likely for them to fail and not gain positions of power is a good thing. That is an argument that I can get behind. That student loans are a form of like uh, culture war that harshly punishes people who take degrees in left wing subjects and then can't get jobs. That to me is like a legitimate argument for screwing these people over. And I guess the last big thing to cover, and I probably should have covered this earlier, is the whole like constitution thing. The whole Biden overstepped his power. The law didn't, the legal law didn't apply. Like, guys, we're so far past that. We're so far past like the Constitution says this, the Constitution says that. If you want to say we're gonna stop this because it's a big L for Biden, because it makes him look retarded, and it makes like it fucks over him over with voters, then I'm all for that. But like, who even cares at this point in time? It's the whole rule of law is so inconsistently enforced. It's so biasedly enforced. I guess it's nice that it's kind of on our side for once, but it's like okay, like sometimes it's good. Sometimes it overturns Roe v. Wade. Sometimes it overturns affirmative action. I don't really see how this is a big W for conservatives because they're just immediately going to spend the money on the military or give it to Ukraine. That is like immediately what they're going to do with it. So it's like our big W guys is, and I think that's literally what happened with the debt ceiling deal. Is like, okay, we're gonna give the military more money, and then we're gonna cut like we're not gonna do this. We're not gonna give the student loan forgiveness, and that was the plan. So I guess it's, but we're so far past like the whole rule of law thing. We're so far past pretending that the court system is like salvageable. Don't get me wrong. I've said this in the past. Just appoint the biggest hacks possible. Like just as I've said, put me on the Supreme Court. If Canadians could serve on the Supreme Court, put me on the Supreme Court. I forgot to give him credit last time, but Nick Fuentes said this a couple years ago. Is just stack every position with the youngest, most like sycophantic people possible who will just vote along ideological lines. That is what the judicial system is like. Any pretense that these people are apolitical or anything like that is just bullshit. If you want to take the argument that this is stopping Biden, so it's a good thing, that's fine. If Trump was doing something like this, then I would just support it because he's more to my liking. So I just don't really get it. I don't think I think the judicial system is just so corrupt and so bad in most Western countries, including Canada, that I just kind of don't really care at this point in time. And it's like there's so many cases where like the government doesn't do what the president says. Like the military basically just runs itself at this point in time. Um, so I don't know. I just don't really care about that. I don't really care if the president is abusing his power. I think we have so many issues beyond that that it's just not something that I really get upset about. Or maybe that's just me being consistent with having a generally authoritarian view of government, so that in and of itself doesn't bother me. What bothers me is who is using that authority. In this case, it's Sleepy Joe. So thank you for enduring, if you made it this far, this incoherent rant about a variety of different topics. God bless, and more content to come.